The Industrial Revolution stands as one of the most transformative periods in human history. While many are familiar with the inventions that define this era, like the steam engine or the telegraph, many are often confused about the complex and disjointed path towards modernity. At its core, the Industrial Revolution was deeply intertwined with imperialism, beginning in Britain, the world's largest empire at the time. By the mid-18th century, Britain controlled about a quarter of the world's landmass, encompassing numerous extractive and oppressive territories. This vast empire enabled the exploitation of resources and the establishment of high-volume trade networks, providing Britain with the means to develop its productive capabilities on the home islands. This convergence of resources and innovation led to unprecedented urbanization and industrialization, particularly in London, but the ripple effects of the successes were felt far beyond Britain's shores. As industrialization took hold, it gave rise to sprawling metropolises like New York and influenced every major power across the globe. Production and population surged, propelling societies into a new era of growth and opportunity. This new era of industrialization was the norm across all developing nations, with one notable exception.
At the beginning of the 19th century, Russia still remained largely an agricultural country. The majority of population consisted of peasants and were basically serfs. They did not possess the land that they labor and cultivated. So imagine it's a vast empire with a diverse population of different kinds of people, Muslims in Central Asia, the Caucasus region, and the Far East region. The dance of this population wasn't exactly the same as in Western Europe, right? So Western Europe was a much more densely populated region with approximately 30 to 40 people on a square kilometer, while in Russia there was 10 to 15 in some parts. The majority of people still lived in European Russia, so it was unregulated kind of diversity of people spread out on the vast territories, and it was completely different picture from what we saw, for example, in Britain and France, where the population lived more or less closely to each other. So imagine this vast land, and it was completely different, as I said, from any other Western European examples that we had, which, that the France and especially Britain industrialized so fast, and so, it was a vast development and big development, while, the major part of why was it possible, because, as I said, the density of population, but in another factor played a role here is what I call the nationalism, because in other European countries it was possible to create this image of a nation in Britain, in France, in other regions, but those two are prime examples where you can imagine yourself being a part of the national body, while in Russia there was a completely different picture, in a way that the empire was so diverse that even Romanovs did not really know exactly what kind of people settle in those corners of empires, which changed in the course of 1860s, when the Russian Empire faced the biggest challenge of that time, and it started nationalizing itself. That's what we call the nationalizing empire. Nationalism played a key role of why it was possible to mobilize working class, which did not perceive themselves as being like a separate nation, but a part of the broader nation. Another key factor why Russia did not industrialize as Britain, for example, is because Russia didn't have colonies in a traditional way. In historical scholarship, there is two types of empires. One is it's what we called overseas empires or modern empires. Those empires that For example, the British Empire, they have colonies. They could exploit colonies and they could produce some extra capital to reinvest that, and it kind of like circles back, which produce an enormous amount of wealth. In Russia, there was no colonies in that traditional way because Russia was a land-based empire, a second type of empires, as, for example, Ottoman Empire or Habsburg Empire. So they never had any colonies somewhere overseas. The thing that we can call colonies are not those colonies in traditional way. Central Asia was not a colony as in traditional way, or Caucasus, for example, or the Russian Far East. So it was really hard to get any extra capital, any extra profit from those places. That's why it was hard to produce something, to sell them, to exploit them, and squeeze them out of the resources and materials they had. Another key element is, I already mentioned it, is the size of Russia. So Russia was a big empire, right? But the question is why they couldn't just extract resources from the ground and kind of use it and produce materials and therefore start this industrialization. The fact is that the territory was really, as I said, largely unsettled. So people didn't live there, and even though they lived, some of them, they couldn't really extract because this kind of production and extraction demands a lot of money, which Russia also didn't have. So one of the interesting examples of this kind of like beginning of industrialization is the building of railroads. At the end of the 19th century, while Britain and Germany and France were covered by railways, which transport goods from one part of the continent to another part of the continent, Russia did not have such a vast network of railways, even though additionally, the railways were of a different size of diameter, which made this kind of transportation of goods from Europe to Russia even more challenging. So Russia struggled with everything, and they didn't even have a normal railway network, which also was one of the causes why Alexander II began the great reform project. Immediate cause of this great reform period was the Russian defeat in the Crimean War, when British and French troops could easily land on the Crimean Peninsula and attack Russian positions, while Russia had to pull forces through the vast territory on couches and horses, and it took an enormous amount of time. So the supply lines and provisions were in a very bad shape. So it kind of caused Alexander II to begin this reforming period, and these reforms, which are called the Great Reforms, profoundly impacted the image of Russia in the 19th and the beginning of 20th century. So Alexander II initiated these great reforms to modernize Russia, to bring it from the a state of the old empire to the modern state. So that's why sometimes these reforms are called liberal reforms or modernizing reforms. And eventually he couldn't finish these reforms because he was killed by what at that time was defined as a terrorist group. Right now we can see this were just a socialist people who were just dissatisfied with the way the reform were developing, and his son Alexander III succeeded him, and he didn't see the things the way his father saw. That's why he did something to revoke the father's reforms, and that's why his period is defined as a counter-reform period. But even though he was a reformist in a way that he wanted to keep autarky in the way it existed for several hundred years, the Russia still stepped into a radically new era of development. And one of the such examples of this radical political and economic development is the kind of like appearance on the historical stage of Sergei Vita, who was from what now is Ukraine. Back then it was called Malorussia. And he first became, which is interesting, he first became the Minister of Transportation, of Railways, right? Because we know already that the railways were it was a big issue. Railway network was not developed. He saw railroads as a main, like a key feature of development of Russia on this kind of like way to become a modern state. Eventually he became a Minister of Finance of Russian Empire, and this was a period where we see how Russia began industrializing, it began modernizing, building factories, building and railroads, building the modern army as well, because modern army demands, a developed system of railways. In general, Russia was undergoing several very different and difficult processes that European countries had undergone decades ago. Nevertheless, because of these great reforms, because of the appointment of Sergei Vita, Russia firmly stood on the European path of development. Of course, it remains largely a peasant country till the end of the Tsarist regime, with little or no educational system outside of big cities and relatively small population. But these processes of urbanization and proletarization already began, and Russia was on its way to become a modern state.
With Tsar Alexander III's death, Russia's next and last emperor rose to power. Nicholas II inherited a Russia that was at a crossroads, as Vita's economic reforms aimed to modernize the country and strengthen its international standing. The construction of this Trans-Siberian Railway, pivotal for expanding Russia's reach and influence in Asia, reflected the Tsar's desire to bolster the nation's infrastructure and economy. To understand this shift towards the east that Nicholas II spearheaded, it's important to understand his position as Tsar and how he sought to deal with the immense responsibility. Growing up, the future Tsar had little access to progressive ideas. His father, Alexander III, was particularly conservative and enforced a strong autocratic rule over all of Russia during his reign. His education was also fairly conservative, which further encouraged him to be a decisive, authoritative leader. This all contrasted with his personality, however, as he was generally seen as a timid, reclusive, sensitive, and overall unfit to rule in an authoritative manner, as was expected of him. He even acknowledged this struggle of personality and responsibility, and this can be explained in two of his own quotes.
«Я не готов стать царем. Я никогда не хотел им становиться. Я ничего не знаю о правлении. Я даже не знаю, как разговаривать с министрами. Пусть все знают, что я, посвящая все свои силы благу народному, буду охранять начало самодержавия так же твердо и неуклонно, как охранял его мой незабвенный покойный родитель».
Nicholas II uttered these two statements within just a single year, publicly displaying the internal dichotomy he was struggling with. This issue would ultimately lead to a series of bad decisions, which, in spite of Vita and other reformist leaders, would lead to significant loss and social upheaval throughout Russia. Despite these issues, the initial efforts of the Tsar were relatively successful. Between 1984 and 1914, for example, Russian coal, oil, gold, copper, iron, steel, and flax production increased dramatically. Russia's share in global industrial production almost doubled from 3.4 to 5.3%, and the Russian state became the largest grain exporter in the world. But even with all of this growth, Russia had a long road ahead of them in order to catch up with the other European powers at the time, especially considering the average wealth of Russians had increased at a fraction of the speed that overall production had. As factories proliferated, millions of peasants migrated to urban areas in search of work, leading to overcrowded cities and harsh living conditions. Workers often faced long hours, low wages, and dangerous environments with little to no labor protections. The lack of social safety nets and inadequate housing contributed to widespread poverty and discontent among the working class, or as was known in Russia, the proletariat class. This rising industrial workforce also experienced a growing sense of class consciousness. Workers began to organize and advocate for their rights, influenced by Marxist ideologies and the labor movements emerging in Europe. Strikes and protests became increasingly common, particularly in response to poor working conditions and the repressive tactics employed by factory owners and the state, and the income gap continued to grow throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In combination with internal pressures, the Tsar also faced external pressures from other European superpowers and even non-European powers like the Japanese state. In Europe, the Russian state saw three main rivals. First was the British, who at this point held an incredibly large amount of territory and economic control across the entire world. The expansiveness of the British Empire directly conflicted with Russian interests, especially in Central Asia, where the so-called Great Game unfolded. Both nations vied for control over territories in Afghanistan and Persia, leading to tensions. The discovery of oil in the Caucasus and the strategic importance of the Suez Canal added further stakes to the rivalry. The belligerent attitude between the British and Russian empires paled in comparison to the German and Austro-Hungarian rivalry, especially considering that both of these countries directly bordered the Russian West, where most of the population and industry of the country resided. Germany's unification and rapid industrialization posed a significant threat to the Russian Empire, and tensions quickly rose in Eastern Europe. Both countries vied for control and influence throughout all of Eastern Europe, which led to increased militarization and aggressive military posturing between the two nations. In contrast to the Germans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not so different from the Russian Empire. Both countries had control over a variety of different ethnic groups, both struggled with industrialization, and both wanted to control the Baltic regions of Europe. Russia sought to support Slavic nationalism, particularly in Serbia, viewing itself as the champion of Slavic interests. This posturing as the leaders of the Slavic people was in direct opposition to the Austro-Hungarian interests, which were to expand their borders and control into more Slavic lands while increasing control over the Slavic peoples already in the empire. Yet, despite the Russian opposition, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908, which angered Russia since they had historically claimed influence over these territories. The crisis escalated tensions, and the Tsar felt humiliated and powerless to assert its interests. The final conflicting power was Japan, which posed direct opposition and conflicts of interest with Russia in Eastern Asia and Manchuria. As I mentioned earlier, the Tsar enforced a policy of expansion in the East, expanding industry and military control over land which had remained relatively untouched for decades. While Russia was building infrastructure and expanding its military presence in the East, Japan was going through a period of modernization and was looking to impose itself as a regional power. The expansion of the Russian Empire into Manchuria and Korea directly conflicted with these interests and ultimately led to war between the two countries. This war began with Japan's surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur on February 8, 1904. This naval base, located at Manchuria, was a strategic asset for Russia and a key logistical center. This attack significantly damaged the Russian fleet, and the subsequent siege would go on for many months, ending in Japanese victory. This battle would set the tone for the rest of the war, where many Japanese forces consistently outmaneuvered and defeated the Russian military. By the end of the war, Russia had lost virtually their entire naval force and sustained about 200,000 casualties. The Treaty of Portsmouth, which ultimately concluded the war, was seen as a diplomatic embarrassment for Russia and the Tsar. The concession of territories and recognition of Japan's claims in Korea signaled a significant loss of influence in a region that the Tsar had vehemently pushed for and had considered vital. This humiliation contributed to a growing sense of urgency within the Russian government to modernize its military and government structures, as officials recognized the necessity of reform and to avoid further international setbacks. The defeat in the Russo-Japanese War exposed the weaknesses of the Russian military while simultaneously highlighting the inadequate and inefficient authoritarian government. leading to widespread humiliation and a crisis of confidence among Russian elite. Following this disastrous defeat, the Russian soldiers who fought in this war all the way on the eastern side of the empire would return home to the west, with many of them returning to horrible working conditions and even worse living conditions. Of course, this inevitably led to strikes and protests breaking out across the entire country, leading to the Revolution of 1905. There was a common cause among all of these strikes and protests. The issue was very clear. The Tsar and his authoritarian government constricted Russia's ability to reform, and the people were becoming increasingly vocal about this problem. Protests were met with aggressive suppression, leading to the events of January 22, 1905. On that cold January day, thousands of workers gathered in St. Petersburg on a march towards the Winter Palace, the official residence of the Tsar. The demonstrators carried religious icons and sang hymns to convey their grievances peacefully. However, as the crowd approached the palace, they were met by armed soldiers who had been ordered to disperse the gathering. What began as a peaceful march quickly escalated into a tragedy. Troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd, leading to chaos and panic. Estimates on the death toll vary, with some accounts suggesting that dozens were killed and hundreds injured in this brutal crackdown. The impact of Bloody Sunday was profound and far-reaching. The massacre shocked the nation, igniting widespread outrage and a wave of protests across the country. Many citizens who had previously held some faith in the Tsar were disillusioned immediately by the brutality of the response. This event marked a crucial shift in public sentiment, leading to an increase in demand for political reform and civil liberties. So, before this event would tip Russia into a full-blown revolution, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to respond in the wake of the unrest. The October Manifesto of 1905 promised certain civil liberties and establishment of the Duma, a legislative assembly intended to give people a voice in governance. While some reforms seemingly satisfied the revolutionaries in the moment, they ultimately changed very little in the Russian government. The Tsar had still retained total veto power, and government decisions would once again be fully up to Nicholas II. Despite this change not satisfying the people, the Tsar got away with this facade by appealing to many leaders of the liberal revolts. By doing this, he split the groups that led the calls for change and resumed repressive measures to quell dissent. Censorship remained strict, and political opponents faced imprisonment, exile, or even execution. This climate of fear discouraged organized resistance from re-emerging and made it difficult for revolutionary movements to gain traction. Over the next decade, the Tsar would maintain this policy of repression and censorship, all while continuing to expand the industrialization effort. The trajectory of the Russian socio-economic development had not changed much, but the Tsar's ability to outlast disgruntled workers proved to be strong enough to maintain growth. Gross domestic production saw immense increases, but, similar to earlier reforms, the proletariat working class reaped minimal rewards, while the ruling classes reaped immense rewards and increased their own wealth dramatically. On the geopolitical front, Russia had completely shifted their focus. Tsar Nicholas II sought to assert Russia's influence in the Balkans and Asia, motivated by a desire to regain status as a great power following the humiliation that was the Russo-Japanese War. The growing tensions in Europe, particularly with Germany and Austria-Hungary, led Russia to strengthen its alliances, more specifically with France. This entanglement in European rivalries and alliances deepened as Russia positioned itself as a defender of the Slavic nations, culminating in increased military readiness and preparations for potential conflict. As these pressures built, Russia found itself on the verge of a profound crisis, struggling under the weight of internal discontent and the looming specter of war. The nation's aspirations to regain its status as a great power clashed with the ambitions of the Austro-Hungarian and German empires, creating a tense geopolitical environment. Domestically, widespread unrest simmered among workers and peasants throughout Russia, who faced harsh living conditions and growing inequality. Their calls for political and social reforms grew louder, fueled by frustration with the Tsarist regime and oppressive measures. This volatile mix of external threats and internal strife created a precarious situation, setting the stage for the upheaval that would soon erupt in World War I, and the revolutions that would ultimately transform the Russian Empire.